Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Anyone who has lived in a quiet suburban cul-de-sac knows there is a rhythm to the mornings. Garage doors opening at 6:15, the distant hum of lawn sprinklers, the same golden retriever being walked by the same retired man at the same hour every single day. My neighborhood in Raleigh, North Carolina, had perfected this monotony over the 12 years since I bought my house, fresh off my divorce and desperate for something uneventful. By 36, I had seen enough chaos to last a lifetime, between failed relationships and a corporate job that nearly gave me an ulcer. So when I moved into a cookie-cutter house on Birchwood Lane, I wanted nothing more than predictable neighbors and forgettable weekends. That March morning started like any other, except I woke up 10 minutes before my alarm to the unmistakable pulse of red and blue lights bleeding through my bedroom blinds. I sat up in bed, disoriented, my dog Murphy already alert at the window with his ears perked forward. The clock on my nightstand read 5:42, which meant something was wrong because nothing ever happened on our street before 7. I shuffled to the window and pulled back the curtain, expecting maybe a fender bender or a medical emergency at one of the older residents' homes. Instead, I counted 3 police cruisers parked diagonally across the road, their lights still spinning but their sirens mercifully silent. 2 unmarked sedans sat further down, and I could see officers gathered on the sidewalk about 2 houses down from mine, right in front of the Prescott's place. Warren and Denise Prescott had moved in maybe 4 years ago, a couple in their late 40s who kept mostly to themselves. They waved when they saw you, they kept their lawn immaculate, and Warren once helped me jump my truck battery during a particularly brutal January. Standing there in my boxers, watching the police tape go up, I remember thinking that something must have happened to one of them. Maybe a heart attack, maybe a fall. By 7:30, I had thrown on jeans and a sweatshirt and taken Murphy out for his morning walk, partly because he needed it, and partly because I am not above admitting I wanted to see what was happening up close. The whole street had come alive by then, neighbors clustered in small groups on their driveways, arms crossed, voices low. I recognized the Chavezes from across the street, and old Mr. Gunderson who lived on the corner and seemed to know everything about everyone. He was the one who told me, his face pale beneath his fishing cap, that Denise Prescott had not come home the night before. Warren had called the police around 3 in the morning after waiting up for her, convinced something terrible had happened. According to Gunderson, Denise had gone to her book club meeting at a friend's house around 7 the previous evening and never returned. Her car, a silver Subaru Outback, was still missing. Warren was apparently inside the house with detectives, and he had been in there for hours already. I walked Murphy past the Prescott house slowly, not wanting to seem like a vulture but unable to look away. The front door was open, and I could see figures moving inside, the occasional flash of a camera. Yellow crime scene tape stretched across the driveway entrance, and a female officer stood guard near the mailbox, her expression unreadable behind dark sunglasses. Warren Prescott was nowhere to be seen, but I noticed his black Ford pickup was parked in its usual spot, recently washed and gleaming despite the grim circumstances. I found myself staring at it for reasons I could not explain. Something about how clean it looked compared to the chaos unfolding around it. Murphy tugged at the leash, eager to continue his route, and I let him pull me forward. But I kept glancing back, this strange tightness forming in my chest, like my body knew something my brain had not figured out yet. The detectives came to my door around noon. There were 2 of them, a tall woman with short gray hair, and a younger guy with a notebook who barely said a word the entire time. The woman introduced herself as Detective Carla Finch and asked if I had a few minutes to answer some questions about my neighbors. I invited them in, offered coffee, which they declined, and we sat in my living room while Murphy watched from his bed in the corner, unusually quiet. Detective Finch started with the basics. How long had I lived here? How well did I know the Prescotts? When was the last time I had seen Denise? I answered everything as best I could, explaining that I was friendly with them but not close, that I had waved to Denise maybe 3 days ago when she was getting her mail. Then Finch leaned forward slightly, her eyes fixed on mine, and asked me something that made the room feel smaller. She wanted to know if I had ever heard yelling coming from their house, raised voices, anything that sounded like an argument. I told her the truth, which was that I had heard them arguing a handful of times over the years, but nothing that seemed out of the ordinary for a married couple. Voices carry in these houses. The walls are not as thick as the builders would have you believe, and sometimes late at night you catch fragments of conversations you were never meant to hear. Finch nodded slowly, scribbling something in her own notebook now, and then she asked about the nights leading up to Denise's disappearance. Had I noticed anything unusual, any lights on at strange hours, any activity in their driveway late at night? That question hit different because now that she mentioned it, I had noticed something. About 4 nights before, I had gotten up around 2 in the morning to use the bathroom, and through my window I had seen Warren loading something into the bed of his truck. It was dark and I was half asleep, but I remembered thinking it was odd because he was carrying what looked like heavy contractor bags, the thick black kind, and he made multiple trips from the garage to the truck. I had assumed he was cleaning out junk, maybe heading to the dump early the next morning. Now, sitting across from Detective Finch, I felt a cold wave wash through me as I recounted this detail. Detective Finch exchanged a glance with her partner that lasted maybe half a second, but it was enough to tell me everything I needed to know. She asked me to describe exactly what I had seen, the size of the bags, how Warren had moved, whether the garage light was on or off. I did my best explaining that the bags looked full and heavy based on how he carried them, that he had made at least 3 or 4 trips, and that he had worked quickly like a man who did not want to be seen. The garage light had been off, I remembered now, and he had used only the dim glow from a flashlight to navigate. When I finished, Finch thanked me and handed me her card, asking me to call if I remembered anything else. After they left, I stood in my kitchen for a long time, staring out the window at the Prescott house, trying to reconcile the Warren I knew with the image forming in my mind. This was a man who had shoveled my driveway without being asked during a snowstorm 2 winters ago. This was a man who brought over banana bread when I first moved in, and now I was telling police that I had watched him load mysterious bags into his truck in the dead of night, just days before his wife vanished. The next 3 days crawled by in a haze of anxiety and obsessive observation. I found myself watching the Prescott house constantly, noting every car that came and went, every time Warren stepped outside to collect his newspaper or stand on his porch looking lost. The police presence had thinned but not disappeared entirely, and news vans had started parking at the end of the street, their satellite dishes pointed at the sky like mechanical sunflowers. Denise's face was everywhere now, on the local news, on flyers that volunteers posted at gas stations and grocery stores, on a Facebook page someone had created called Find Denise Prescott. Her silver Subaru had been found abandoned in a parking lot near the Neuse River, about 20 miles from our neighborhood, and that discovery seemed to shift something in the investigation. The news anchors started using phrases like person of interest without naming names, but everyone on Birchwood Lane knew exactly who they meant. Warren stopped coming outside after that. His curtains stayed drawn, his truck unmoved, and the banana bread neighbor I thought I knew became a shadow behind glass. It was on the 5th day after Denise's disappearance that I made the discovery. I had taken Murphy on our usual evening walk, trying to stick to our routine despite everything, and we wandered toward the small community garden at the back of the neighborhood. It was a shared space where a dozen families kept vegetable plots, bordered by a wooden fence and a strip of untended land that backed up against a drainage ditch. Murphy loved sniffing around there, and I usually let him explore while I checked my phone or just breathed in the quiet. That evening, he pulled me toward the far edge of the garden, past the tomato cages and the compost bins, toward a patch of ground I had never paid much attention to before. It was behind a row of overgrown azalea bushes, hidden from casual view, and Murphy was digging at the dirt with an intensity that made me uneasy. I pulled him back and looked at what had caught his attention. The ground there was different from the surrounding area, darker and slightly sunken, like something had been buried and the earth had settled. There were no leaves or debris on that patch, even though everything around it was covered in the usual garden mulch and fallen twigs. I stood there for what felt like 10 minutes, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Part of me wanted to walk away, to convince myself it was nothing, maybe just a spot where someone had dug up a dead plant or buried kitchen scraps for compost. But the shape of it was wrong. Too long and narrow, roughly 6 feet from end to end. I thought about the contractor bags Warren had loaded into his truck, how heavy they had looked, how he had worked in the dark like a man with something to hide. I thought about Denise, her smiling face on all those flyers, her car abandoned by the river. My hands fumbled for my phone, and I dialed Detective Finch's number before I could talk myself out of it. She answered on the third ring, and I told her what I had found, my voice cracking as I described the location. She told me not to touch anything, to go home and wait, that she would send someone immediately. I walked back to my house in a daze, Murphy trotting beside me like nothing had happened, and I sat on my porch watching the sun go down, waiting for the sirens I knew would come. The police arrived within the hour, a whole convoy of them, and they blocked off the entrance to the community garden with tape and floodlights. I watched from my backyard as they worked through the night, their silhouettes moving against the artificial brightness like figures in a nightmare. Detective Finch came to my door around 11 to ask me a few follow-up questions, and to thank me for calling it in. She did not tell me what they had found, but her face told me enough. The next morning, the news confirmed what I already knew in my gut. Human remains had been recovered from behind the community garden, and while official identification was pending, sources close to the investigation believed it was Denise Prescott. Warren was taken into custody that same afternoon, led out of his house in handcuffs while the neighbors watched in stunned silence. I saw him walk past the spot where he had helped me jump my truck battery, past the driveway where he had waved at me 100 times and he never once looked up. His face was blank, empty, like whatever human thing had lived behind his eyes had packed up and left a long time ago. The timeline Warren had given police fell apart completely once they started digging, both literally and figuratively. He had claimed Denise left for her book club at 7 and never came home, but her friend from the book club told detectives that Denise had canceled that evening, saying she was not feeling well. Phone records showed Denise had been home all night. Neighbors on the other side of the Prescotts, people I had never spoken to, came forward saying they had heard a loud argument around 9 that evening, followed by a heavy thud, and then silence. I learned later that the contractor bags I had seen Warren loading contained not just Denise, but also the bloody carpet from their bedroom and the clothes he had been wearing. He had driven to the garden that same night, buried everything in a shallow grave he thought no one would ever find, then spent the next few days washing his truck and rehearsing his story. The trial lasted 3 weeks. I testified about what I had seen through my window, about the bags in the darkness and the way he had moved like a man racing against the sunrise. Warren was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. I still live on Birchwood Lane because I could not afford to move, and because part of me refused to let what happened drive me out of my home. But I never walk past that garden anymore, and some nights, when I cannot sleep, I stand at my window and stare at the Prescott house, now empty and slowly falling into disrepair, and I wonder how many secrets hide behind the walls of quiet suburban streets, waiting for someone to notice the wrong thing at the wrong time. September of 2018 found me in a place most people dream about, but rarely reach. My husband Kevin and I had just closed on our first house in a quiet suburb outside of Denver, Colorado. One of those neighborhoods where everyone waves from their driveways and kids still ride bikes until the streetlights come on. Turning 30 that spring had felt like crossing some invisible finish line, and buying this house cemented the feeling that we had finally made it. Kevin worked as a regional sales manager for a medical equipment company, which meant he traveled often, sometimes for days at a time. I worked remotely as a content strategist for a tech startup, so I spent most of my hours alone in our new home, getting used to its creaks and settling sounds. We had been living there for about 3 months when this happened, long enough to feel comfortable but not quite long enough to know every noise the house made. That particular Thursday started like any other day when Kevin was on the road. He had flown out to Minneapolis early Monday morning for a conference that would keep him busy until Saturday. We had our little routine down by then, texting throughout the day and doing a video call before bed every night. The house sat at the end of Birchwood Lane, a cul-de-sac with only 4 other homes, all spaced generously apart with mature trees providing privacy between properties. Our nearest neighbor, an elderly widow named Dorothy, lived about 50 yards away, her porch light the only visible glow from our windows at night. I remember feeling so safe there, so insulated from the chaos of the world. That Thursday evening, I made myself a simple dinner, watched some show I cannot even remember now, and headed upstairs around 10 to get ready for bed. Kevin and I did our nightly video call. He showed me the boring hotel room, complained about conference food, and we said goodnight around 11. I plugged in my phone, turned off the lamp, and fell asleep faster than usual. Something pulled me out of sleep around 2 in the morning. Not a dream, not a need to use the bathroom, just this sudden alertness like my brain had registered something before my conscious mind caught up. I lay there in the dark, eyes open, staring at the ceiling fan spinning lazily above me. The house was silent in that heavy way houses get in the middle of the night, when even the refrigerator hum seems amplified. I was about to close my eyes and drift off again when I heard it. A distinct creak from somewhere above me. We had a finished attic that we used for storage, accessible through a pull-down ladder in the upstairs hallway. My first thought, the one that made perfect sense in my sleepy brain, was that Kevin had come home early to surprise me. He had done that once before, cutting a trip short because he missed me. I smiled in the dark, already composing the teasing text I would send him about trying to be sneaky. Then I heard another footstep, heavier this time, directly over the bedroom. I sat up slowly, ears straining in the darkness. The footsteps continued, deliberate and measured, crossing from one side of the attic to the other. They did not sound rushed or random like an animal would make. These were human footsteps, and they were pacing. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, and that is when the first real prickle of unease crept into my chest. Kevin would have texted me if he was coming home early. Kevin would have called out when he got inside. Kevin would not be walking around in the attic at 2 in the morning in complete darkness. I unlocked my phone and pulled up his contact, my thumb hovering over the call button. The footsteps stopped directly above the bedroom door. I held my breath, counting the seconds of silence, telling myself I was being ridiculous, that old houses make noises, that I was half asleep and imagining things. Then I heard the attic ladder unfold. The long, groaning creak of it being pulled down into the upstairs hallway, just 15 feet from my bedroom door. My entire body went cold. I did not scream, did not jump out of bed, did not do any of the things you imagine yourself doing in a situation like this. Instead, I became very still, very quiet, like some primal part of my brain had taken over and decided that invisibility was survival. I could hear the ladder settling into place, then the unmistakable sound of weight on the rungs, someone climbing down, one careful step at a time. I slid out of bed as silently as I could, my bare feet finding the carpet without a sound. The bedroom door was closed but not locked because we never locked interior doors. Why would we? This was our home. This was supposed to be safe. I crouched beside the bed on the far side, putting it between me and the door, and dialed 911. The screen seemed impossibly bright in the darkness, and I shielded it with my hand as it rang once, twice, then connected. The operator's voice was calm, professional, asking what my emergency was. I whispered so quietly I was not sure she could hear me at first. "Someone is in my house." I told her the address, my voice barely a breath. I could hear footsteps now in the hallway, slow and deliberate, the floorboards protesting under each step. The operator asked me to stay on the line, told me officers were being dispatched, asked if I could get to a safe room. I was already in the master bedroom, I told her, on the second floor, but the door did not have a lock. She told me to barricade it if I could, to stay hidden, to keep the line open. I crawled toward the door, phone pressed to my ear, and as gently as possible wedged our small reading chair under the handle. It would not hold against a determined push, but it was something. As I backed away from the door, I heard the footsteps stop just on the other side, close enough that I could hear breathing, slow, steady, controlled, not panicked, not hurried. Whoever was out there was in no rush at all. I pressed myself against the wall beside the closet and whispered to the operator that he was right outside my door. The operator's voice remained steady, a lifeline in the dark. She told me units were 4 minutes out, that I needed to stay quiet, stay hidden, not to engage. 4 minutes. It sounds like nothing when you say it out loud, but crouched against that wall in the pitch black with a stranger breathing on the other side of a hollow wooden door, 4 minutes stretched into something endless. I heard the doorknob turn slowly, the mechanism clicking as it rotated all the way to the right. Then pressure against the door, gentle at first, testing. The chair scraped an inch against the floor and held. Silence. I clamped my hand over my mouth to muffle my own breathing, tears streaming down my face without me even realizing I was crying. The operator kept asking if I was still there, and I could only manage the smallest sound of acknowledgement. Then the footsteps retreated from my door, moving further down the hallway. I heard another doorknob turn, the guest bedroom, then another, the bathroom. He was checking every room methodically, patiently, like he had all the time in the world. The operator told me she had confirmed my husband's location. Kevin was still in Minneapolis, checked into his hotel, his phone pinging from there just moments ago. It was not him. I already knew that, but hearing her say it made the reality crash down harder. There was a stranger in my home, someone who had been hiding in our attic, someone who had waited until the middle of the night to come down. The footsteps returned to the hallway, and I heard him stop at the top of the stairs. For a moment, everything went quiet. No movement, no breathing, nothing. Then I heard him descend, each step creaking under his weight, slow and unhurried. The operator told me to stay where I was, that officers were almost there, that I was doing everything right. I heard him reach the bottom of the stairs, heard him moving through the first floor now, opening cabinets, drawers, the refrigerator. The sounds were almost casual, domestic, as if he lived there and was simply looking for a midnight snack. It was that normalcy that terrified me more than anything else. Red and blue lights swept across the bedroom ceiling before I heard the sirens. The operator told me police were on scene, that I should stay put until they announced themselves. I heard car doors slam, muffled shouting from outside, then the front door being forced open with a crash that shook the whole house. Heavy boots pounded through the first floor, voices calling out commands, clearing rooms. The operator stayed on the line with me the entire time, her voice a steady anchor as chaos erupted downstairs. I heard them sweep through the kitchen, the living room, the dining area. Then footsteps on the stairs coming up fast and a loud voice announcing police presence. I called out that I was in the master bedroom, that the door was barricaded. An officer responded, telling me to stay calm, that they were coming to me. I pushed the chair aside with trembling hands and opened the door to find 2 officers with flashlights and drawn weapons, their faces tense but controlled. One of them, a woman with close-cropped gray hair and kind eyes, asked if I was hurt. I shook my head, unable to form words, and she guided me out of the room while her partner continued clearing the upstairs. They brought me downstairs and sat me on the living room couch, a blanket wrapped around my shoulders even though I was not cold. More officers moved through the house, checking closets, the basement, every possible hiding spot. The back door was open, the one that led from the kitchen to our small patio, and an officer was examining the frame with a flashlight. "That is how he got out," one of them said. The door had been unlocked from the inside. Someone radioed in that the perimeter was clear, that the subject had fled before they arrived. The woman officer sat down next to me and asked if I could describe what happened. I told her everything: the footsteps in the attic, the ladder coming down, the breathing outside my door, the sounds of him moving through my house like he owned it. She wrote it all down, her expression growing more serious with each detail. Then another officer came in from the hallway, holding something in a gloved hand. It was my phone, the one I had been using to call 911, still recording. I had dropped it at some point and forgotten. He said the line had stayed open the entire time, and dispatch had captured everything. A detective arrived about an hour later, a stocky man in his 50s named Reeves, who had the tired eyes of someone who had seen too much over too many years. He listened to the recording from the 911 call with me sitting right there, and I had to relive every moment of it in real time. The footsteps, the creaking ladder, the doorknob turning, the silence that followed. But it was what came at the end that made Detective Reeves lean forward and replay the audio 3 times. After the police had entered through the front, after all the shouting and chaos, there was a stretch of about 40 seconds where my phone had been lying on the floor near the bedroom door. In that window, just before an officer picked it up, the recording captured something none of us had heard in the moment. Breathing, slow, deliberate, close to the microphone, then a long exhale, almost like a sigh, directly into the phone. The intruder had walked right past it on his way out. He had seen it recording, and instead of running, he had stopped, leaned down and breathed into it, like he wanted us to know he had been there, like he was leaving a signature. They searched the attic the next morning and found evidence that someone had been living up there. A sleeping bag tucked behind old boxes, empty water bottles, granola bar wrappers, a small flashlight. There was a window at the far end of the attic that led onto a section of roof, and from there, it would have been easy enough to climb down the oak tree that brushed against the back of the house. That is how he had been getting in and out. For how long, no one could say. Forensics found partial fingerprints on the water bottles, but no match in the system. The sleeping bag was generic, sold at dozens of stores across the state. They canvassed the neighborhood, talked to Dorothy and the other neighbors, but no one had seen anything unusual. Whoever he was, he had been careful, patient. He had watched Kevin leave for trips. He had known my routine. The thought that he might have been up there for days, maybe weeks, listening to me move through my own home, sleeping just above my head while I slept below, made me physically ill. I threw up twice that morning and could not stop shaking for hours. Kevin flew home that same day, cutting his trip short the moment I called him. We stayed in a hotel for 2 weeks while a security company installed new locks, motion sensors, cameras, and an alarm system that could wake the entire neighborhood. We sealed the attic window permanently and bolted the ladder access with a heavy padlock. Kevin wanted to sell the house immediately, but I refused. I know that sounds insane, but something in me could not let this stranger take that from us too. We had worked so hard for that house, dreamed about it for years, and I was not going to let one terrible night erase all of that. So we stayed, and slowly, painfully, I learned to sleep there again. It took months of therapy, a prescription for anti-anxiety medication, and a very patient husband who never once made me feel crazy for checking the attic 3 times before bed every single night. The case went cold after a few months. Detective Reeves called occasionally with updates that were never really updates, just reminders that whoever had been living in our attic was still out there somewhere. 6 years have passed since that night. We still live in the same house, though we have renovated the attic into a proper guest room with its own lock and security camera. I have never heard unexplained footsteps again. No one has ever come forward. No match has ever been found for those fingerprints, and the man who breathed into my phone remains a ghost in every sense but the literal one. Sometimes I wonder if he moved on to someone else's attic, someone else's life. Sometimes I wonder if he is in prison for something unrelated, or dead in a ditch somewhere, or living a perfectly normal existence 2 towns over. I will probably never know. What I do know is that I will never again assume that the sounds in my house are just the house settling. I will never again feel completely safe when Kevin travels. And every single night before I go to bed, I checked the attic. I checked the locks. I checked the cameras. Because the worst part of what happened to me was not the fear I felt that night. It was learning that someone had been watching me, studying me, existing just above my head for God knows how long, and I had no idea. That kind of violation does not heal. You just learn to live with the scar. My neighbor Garrett once told me that owning a house means learning to sleep through noises that would have sent you dialing 911 in an apartment. He was right about that. After closing on my first place in March of 2018, a modest 3-bedroom in a quiet suburb outside Denver, I became intimately familiar with every creak and groan the structure could produce. The refrigerator cycling on, the water heater doing its thing, the foundation settling when temperatures dropped. My 10-year high school reunion had just passed, reminding me that most guys my age were married with kids by now, while I was spending my evenings assembling IKEA furniture alone and feeling pretty good about it. The house sat at the end of Birchwood Court, a cul-de-sac with 6 other homes, all occupied by families who waved politely but kept to themselves. I worked as a software engineer for a company downtown, which meant early mornings, and sometimes staying late to meet deadlines. The commute was 40 minutes each way, but the neighborhood felt safe, the mortgage was reasonable, and I finally had a garage to store all the camping gear I kept promising myself I would use more often. The first time I heard the noise, I was deep asleep and my brain incorporated it into a dream about someone dropping silverware in a restaurant kitchen. When I finally surfaced into consciousness, the sound had stopped, and my bedroom was silent, except for the hum of the ceiling fan. I checked my phone, 3:17 in the morning. I lay there for maybe 10 minutes, ears straining, but nothing else came. The rational part of my brain immediately started cataloging explanations. The garage door tracks contracting in the cold, maybe a raccoon knocking something over outside, possibly the metal shelving unit I had installed the previous weekend settling under the weight of storage bins. Colorado nights in early spring could swing 30 degrees between afternoon and midnight, and I had read somewhere that temperature fluctuations cause all kinds of metal expansion and contraction. I remember thinking how annoying it would be if this became a regular thing, already dreading the sleep disruption. What I did not think, not even for a second, was that someone might be outside my house at 3 in the morning, testing whether my garage door would give. The noise came back 4 nights later, same metallic clanking, same approximate time, somewhere between 3 and 3:30. This time it pulled me out of sleep faster, and I caught the tail end of it, a faint scraping sound followed by 2 distinct clicks like someone tapping a wrench against a pipe. I sat up in bed, heart beating a little faster than I wanted to admit, and waited. Nothing. Complete silence. I grabbed my phone and opened the security app out of habit, but the camera I had installed only covered the front porch and part of the driveway. The garage sat on the left side of the house, completely out of frame. I made a mental note to buy another camera, then spent 20 minutes scrolling through the footage anyway, watching empty concrete and the occasional moth fluttering past the lens. By the time I convinced myself to go back to sleep, the sky was already starting to lighten. At work the next day, I mentioned it to a coworker named Dennis who had owned his home for over a decade. He laughed and said, "Welcome to homeownership," told me his attic sounded like a bowling alley every winter, and suggested I check if any of my garage shelving was loose. That weekend I inspected every inch of the garage. I tightened bolts on the metal shelving, checked the tracks on the automatic door, even crawled underneath my workbench to see if anything had fallen behind it. Everything looked fine. The side door that led to the backyard was locked with a deadbolt, same as always, and the main garage door sat flush against the concrete floor with no visible gaps. I stood there for a while, hands on my hips, feeling slightly foolish for being so thorough about what was probably just the house settling. The garage smelled like motor oil and cardboard boxes, completely ordinary, and sunlight streamed through the small window near the ceiling. Nothing sinister here, I told myself. Just an old structure doing old structure things. I went back inside, made some coffee, and spent the rest of the Saturday convincing myself that the whole thing was nothing. But that night, before going to bed, I found myself double-checking the lock on the side garage door for the first time since moving in. I told myself it was just being cautious, responsible homeowner stuff. Deep down, though, something had shifted, a small seed of unease that I could not quite name. 2 weeks passed without incident, and I started to relax. The night stayed quiet, my sleep improved, and I stopped checking the security app obsessively before bed. Work picked up with a major project deadline approaching, which meant I was staying at the office until 8 or 9 most evenings, sometimes grabbing dinner at my desk just to push through the workload. My car would not pull into the driveway until well after dark, and by then I was too exhausted to think about mysterious garage noises. I figured whatever had been causing the sound, thermal expansion, settling foundation, overactive imagination, had simply stopped. Problem solved without me having to do anything. I even joked about it with Garrett one afternoon when we were both checking our mailboxes, and he nodded knowingly and said every new homeowner goes through a paranoid phase. His words made me feel better, more grounded. I was just another guy adjusting to the responsibilities of owning property, jumping at shadows like everyone else did in their first year. The camera I had planned to buy for the garage stayed in my Amazon cart, unpurchased, because it no longer seemed necessary. Then came the night of April 19th. I remember the exact date because it was a Thursday, and Thursdays were the one day I left work early to play basketball at the rec center with some guys from college. My car was gone from the driveway between 6 and 10 in the evening. A predictable window, same every week, had been for months. I got home around 10:30, tired and sore from the game, and went straight to bed without even showering. The clanking woke me at 3:08, but this time it was different. This time it was louder, more deliberate, and it did not stop after a few seconds. I lay there in the dark, listening to a rhythmic scraping sound that went on for maybe 30 seconds, paused, then started again. Metal on metal, with a faint squeaking undertone that reminded me of someone prying open a paint can. My mouth went dry. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, hands unsteady, and pulled up the security app. The front porch camera showed nothing. Empty driveway, my car parked exactly where I had left it, streetlight casting its usual orange glow across the pavement. I do not know what made me get out of bed. Maybe it was weeks of accumulated frustration, or maybe some primal part of my brain had finally accepted what the rational part kept denying. I grabbed the aluminum baseball bat I kept in my closet, a relic from my high school days that I had never actually used for self-defense, and walked barefoot through the dark hallway toward the kitchen. The house was completely silent now. The scraping had stopped the moment I stood up, almost as if whoever or whatever was making it had sensed my movement. I stood by the back door for what felt like an eternity, bat raised, ears straining for any sound. Nothing. Just the hum of the refrigerator and my own pulse pounding in my temples. I wanted to open the door, to step outside and confront whatever was out there. But something held me back. Fear, yes, but also something else. A gut instinct telling me that walking into my backyard at 3 in the morning was exactly what I should not do. So I stood there, frozen by indecision, until the first gray light of dawn started creeping through the kitchen window. Only then did I lower the bat and let myself breathe. The next morning I called in sick to work and drove to Home Depot before they even opened. I sat in my car in the parking lot, scrolling through my phone, researching security cameras with night vision and motion detection. By noon, I had installed 2 new cameras, one pointed directly at the side garage door, another covering the back corner of the house near the fence. The system was wireless and connected to my phone, with alerts that would wake me up the second anything moved within range. I spent the rest of the day testing the angles, adjusting the sensitivity, making sure there were no blind spots. Garrett saw me on a ladder and wandered over, asking if everything was all right. I told him I was just upgrading security, nothing serious, but the look on my face must have said otherwise because he offered to keep an eye out for anything unusual. That night I went to bed with my phone on the pillow beside me, volume turned all the way up, and the bat leaning against my nightstand. I did not sleep well, but I slept, and for the first time in weeks, no sound woke me up. The cameras recorded 8 hours of absolute stillness, nothing but empty concrete and the occasional cat wandering through frame. Thursday came around again, and I almost skipped basketball. Almost. But I had already missed 2 weeks. The guys were counting on me, and I refused to let some random noise turn me into a prisoner in my own home. So I grabbed my gym bag, locked up the house, and drove to the rec center like I always did. The game ran late, one of those nights where everyone wanted to play one more round, and I did not get home until almost 11. I pulled into the driveway, hit the garage door opener, and sat in my car for a moment, scanning the darkness beyond my headlights. Everything looked normal. The motion lights on the side of the house had not been triggered. The garage door rolled up smoothly, and the backyard fence stood undisturbed. I parked inside, closed the garage behind me, and went to bed feeling almost silly about how paranoid I had become. The sound did not come that night. I woke up at 7 feeling rested for the first time in weeks, made coffee, and checked the security footage out of habit. That is when I saw him. The timestamp read 9:47 the previous evening. About an hour after I had left for basketball, a figure crouched beside the garage side door, barely visible in the infrared glow, holding something long and thin in his right hand. I replayed the footage maybe 20 times, each viewing making my stomach twist tighter. The man was wearing dark clothing, a hoodie pulled up over his head, and what looked like work gloves. He moved slowly, deliberately, like someone who had done this before and knew exactly how much time he had. The object in his hand was a screwdriver, at least 18 inches long, the kind mechanics use to reach deep into engine compartments. I watched him insert it into the gap between the door and the frame, wiggling it back and forth, applying pressure in short, controlled bursts. The motion explained the metallic scraping I had been hearing for weeks. He worked on the door for almost 4 minutes, checking periodically toward the street, before suddenly stopping and retreating into the shadows along my fence line. The camera lost him after that. He knew exactly where the blind spots were, which meant he had been watching long enough to map them out. But the detail that made me put down my coffee and just sit there, unable to move, was simpler than that. He had come on a Thursday night. He had come when my car was not in the driveway. He had been watching my routine closely enough to know exactly when I would be gone. I called the police within the hour. 2 officers arrived, a man and a woman, both looking slightly skeptical until I showed them the footage on my laptop. Their expressions changed immediately. The female officer, whose name tag read Fuentes, told me this was textbook pre-burglary surveillance, someone casing a house, learning the patterns, waiting for the right moment to make entry. She asked if I had noticed anyone unfamiliar in the neighborhood recently, any cars parked for too long, any strangers walking past more than once. I thought about it and came up empty. Whoever this guy was, he was careful. The male officer took a copy of the footage and said they would increase patrols in the area, but warned me that without a clear image of the suspect's face, there was not much they could do unless he was caught in the act. Before leaving, Officer Fuentes suggested I vary my routine, never leave at the same time twice and consider adopting a large dog. She said it half-jokingly, but the look in her eyes was serious. That afternoon I called a locksmith and had every lock in the house replaced with high-security deadbolts. I installed a steel reinforcement plate on the garage side door and added a secondary latch that could only be opened from inside. The whole thing cost me almost $2,000, but I would have paid 10 times that amount for the ability to sleep at night. The following Thursday, I did not go to basketball. Instead, I parked my car 2 blocks away at Garrett's house. He agreed to help after I explained the situation, and sat in my dark living room with the curtains drawn, watching the security feed on my phone. The hours crawled by. 9 o'clock, nothing. 10 o'clock, nothing. By 11, I was starting to think he had given up, moved on to an easier target, found some other house with a predictable owner. Then at 11:34, the motion alert lit up my screen. There he was. Same hoodie, same gloves, Same deliberate crouch beside my garage door. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the long screwdriver, positioned it against the frame, and started working. I had already dialed 911 before he finished his first pry. I gave the dispatcher my address, told her someone was actively trying to break into my garage, and watched on camera as the man worked for another 90 seconds before headlights swept across the street. He saw them too. He pulled back from the door, pocketed the screwdriver, and started walking casually toward the fence. But he was too slow. The patrol car that Officer Fuentes had promised turned onto Birchwood Court just as he reached the corner of my property. I watched him freeze in the spotlight, hands going up, and I finally let myself exhale. His name was Carl Bruner, 43 years old, and he lived in a rental house less than a mile from my neighborhood. The police found a notebook in his car with addresses, schedules, and notes about 6 different homes in the area. Mine was the 4th entry on the list. He had written down the days I left for basketball, the approximate times my lights went off at night, even a description of my car and license plate number. The detective who called me the following week said Bruner had a history of burglaries going back 15 years, mostly targeting single men living alone, because they were less likely to have security systems or dogs. He had been watching my house for almost 2 months before making his first attempt. 2 months of driving past, noting when I came and went, waiting for the perfect pattern to emerge. I testified at his trial 6 months later and he got 8 years. I moved out of that house before the lease on my sanity expired completely, sold it to a young couple who probably have no idea what almost happened in their garage. These days, I live in an apartment complex with a doorman and security cameras in every hallway. I still play basketball on Thursdays, but I take a different route home every single time, and I never park in the same spot twice. Some people might call that paranoid. I call it learning the hard way that the scariest monsters are not the ones hiding under your bed. They are the ones sitting in parked cars across the street, writing down your schedule in a notebook, waiting for the night you finally let your guard down. My sister had just gotten engaged when I moved into the duplex on Crescent Road, which made everyone in my family forget to worry about me for once. At 31, freshly divorced and learning how to exist in silence again, I figured a small place in a quiet neighborhood outside of Portland was exactly what I needed. The duplex was nothing fancy. 2 bedrooms, a narrow kitchen with laminate counters from the 80s, and a backyard the size of a parking spot. The other unit had been vacant for months, which the landlord mentioned like it was a selling point. "Peace and quiet," he said, handing me the keys on a Friday afternoon in late October. I worked remotely as a medical transcriptionist, so my days blurred together in a haze of audio files and coffee cups. The neighbors on either side were older couples who waved politely, but never lingered for conversation. I told myself this was healing. I told myself the emptiness in my chest would eventually fill with something other than the echo of my ex-husband's accusations. For the first 3 weeks, I slept better than I had in years. It started with the kitchen chair. I remember because it was a Monday, and I always did laundry on Mondays. One of those pointless routines that made me feel like I had some control over my life. When I walked into the kitchen that morning, one of the chairs at my small table was pulled out at an angle, like someone had just gotten up from eating breakfast. I stared at it for a solid minute, trying to remember if I had sat there the night before. I hadn't. I had eaten dinner on the couch watching some true crime documentary, the plate balanced on my knees. But I pushed the thought away, told myself I must have bumped it while half asleep getting water in the middle of the night. The brain does strange things when you live alone. You start second-guessing every small action, because there's no one else to confirm your reality. I pushed the chair back in and poured my coffee, but I kept glancing at the table throughout the day. That night, before bed, I made a point of checking that all 4 chairs were tucked in neatly. I even took a photo on my phone, laughing at myself for being paranoid. When I woke up the next morning, The same chair was pulled out again, at the exact same angle. I called my friend Natalie that afternoon, trying to make it sound like a joke. "I think I'm losing my mind," I said, and she laughed because that's what you do when someone says something like that. She suggested maybe I was sleepwalking, something I had never done before but seemed like a reasonable explanation. "Stress can rewire your brain," she said, and God knows the divorce had put me through enough. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe I was just a woman struggling to adjust, that my subconscious was playing tricks on me in the dark hours. But the next few days brought more inconsistencies. The cabinet above the stove, the one where I kept my rarely used baking supplies, was cracked open when I came downstairs on Wednesday. On Friday, the back doormat, a faded green rectangle I had bought at a thrift store, had shifted about an inch to the left. These were such small things, insignificant things, the kind of things you notice and then immediately question whether you notice them at all. I started taking photos of everything before bed, the chairs, the cabinets, the mat. Every morning I would compare, and every morning something was different. The weekend came and I barely slept. I lay in bed listening to the house settle, to the wind pushing against the windows, to the refrigerator humming its low mechanical song. Every creak made my heart pound. I thought about calling my mom, but she would just tell me to come stay with her, and I was too proud for that. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? Someone is moving my chairs? They would think I was crazy. Instead, I bought a cheap security camera online and set it up in the kitchen, angled toward the back door and the table. The first night, I watched the footage in the morning and saw nothing, just 8 hours of stillness, my kitchen frozen in grayscale. The second night, same thing. By the third night, I had almost convinced myself that Natalie was right, that stress was making me see patterns in chaos. But then I noticed the camera had been moved, not much, maybe half an inch. Tilted slightly upward so it no longer captured the back door. Just the ceiling and the top of the refrigerator. I had not touched it. That was the moment I stopped doubting myself. Someone had been inside my house. Someone had stood in my kitchen while I slept upstairs and adjusted my camera so they wouldn't be recorded. The realization hit me like ice water. Not fear exactly, but something worse. A violation so intimate it made my skin feel like it didn't belong to me anymore. I checked every window, every door, all locked. I inspected the back door lock closely and noticed faint scratches around the keyhole, thin silver lines against the brass that I had never seen before. I called a locksmith that same day and had all the locks changed. New deadbolts, new keys, a chain lock on the back door for good measure. The locksmith was a quiet man named Howard with grease-stained fingers and kind eyes. He asked if everything was all right, and I lied and said I had just lost my keys. He didn't push. That night I slept with a kitchen knife on my nightstand and my phone clutched in my hand. I told myself the new locks would fix everything. I told myself whoever it was would find the doors impenetrable now and move on to an easier target. For 5 days, nothing happened. No moved chairs, no open cabinets. The mat stayed exactly where I left it. I started to breathe again. I even laughed at myself one morning, standing in the kitchen with my coffee, feeling foolish for the knife still sitting on my nightstand. Maybe it had been nothing. Maybe there was some rational explanation I couldn't see. A draft from the vents, the house settling in ways that shifted objects, my own exhausted mind filling in gaps with paranoia. I called Natalie and told her I thought it was over, whatever it had been. She said she was relieved, that she had been worried about me. On the 6th night, I went to bed without checking the doors twice. I didn't take photos. I didn't lie awake listening. I just slept, deeply and dreamlessly, the kind of sleep I hadn't had in weeks. And then, sometime around 3 in the morning, I woke to a sound, a soft thump, distant but unmistakable, the back door closing. I sat up in bed, my heart slamming against my ribs so hard I could hear it in my ears. For a long moment I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just listened, straining to hear anything else. Footsteps, breathing, the creak of a floorboard. Nothing. Just silence so thick it felt like pressure. My phone was in my hand before I realized I had grabbed it, and I dialed 911 with fingers that felt numb and clumsy. The dispatcher's voice was calm, almost too calm, asking me what my emergency was. I whispered that someone had been in my house, that I heard my back door close, that I was alone. She told me to stay in my room, to lock my bedroom door if I could, that officers were on their way. I didn't have a lock on my bedroom door. It was an old house, and the bedrooms just had those simple knobs with no mechanism. So I pushed my dresser in front of the door, the wooden legs scraping against the hardwood loud enough that if anyone was still inside, they would have heard me. I crouched in the corner between my bed and the wall, the kitchen knife in one hand and my phone in the other, watching the door like it might burst open at any second. The police arrived in what felt like hours, but was probably only 8 minutes. I heard them knock, heard them announce themselves, and I had to force myself to move the dresser and walk downstairs to let them in. There were 2 officers, a tall woman with a blonde ponytail pulled tight, and a shorter man with a thick mustache who looked like he had seen 100 calls like this. They searched the entire house, every room, every closet, even the small crawl space in the basement that I had never opened. Nothing. No one. The back door was unlocked, which they noted with serious expressions, but there was no sign of forced entry. No broken windows, no jimmied locks. The blonde officer, her name tag said Delgado, asked if I was sure I had locked the door before bed. I wanted to scream at her. Of course I was sure. I had checked it 3 times. I had new locks installed less than a week ago, but I just nodded, my voice stuck somewhere in my throat. They told me to call if anything else happened, gave me a case number, and left. I stood in my kitchen as the sun started to rise, feeling more alone than I had ever felt in my life. The light came in slowly through the window above the sink, pale and gray like the sky couldn't commit to morning. I was still standing there, arms wrapped around myself, when I noticed it. At first I thought it was a shadow, some trick of the early light playing on the hardwood floor. But as the room grew brighter, the shape became unmistakable. A footprint. A single muddy footprint on the floor near the hallway entrance. The hallway that led to the stairs, that led to my bedroom. It was large, much larger than my own feet, with a distinct tread pattern pressed into the dried mud. I knelt down and stared at it, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The police had walked all over my house just hours ago, but their boots had been clean. I remembered noticing that, the way Officer Delgado had wiped her feet on the mat before stepping inside. This print was fresh. The mud was still slightly damp at the edges, and it was facing toward the hallway. Not toward the back door, like someone leaving. Toward my bedroom, like someone who had been walking deeper into the house. Toward me. I took a photo of the footprint and called the police again. A different officer came this time, a younger guy with a shaved head who looked barely old enough to drink. He examined the print, took his own photos, and asked me a series of questions that made me feel like I was the suspect. Did I have any enemies? Had I recently ended a relationship? Was there anyone who might have a key to my house? That last question hit me like a punch to the chest. The landlord. He would have a key, or at least he would have had a key before I changed the locks. But the locks were new, brand new, unless someone had made a copy before Howard installed them. Unless someone had been watching, had seen the locksmith leave, had known exactly when I felt safe enough to let my guard down. The officer said they would increase patrols in the area, that I should consider staying with a friend or family member for a few days. He didn't say they would catch whoever was doing this. He didn't promise me anything. After he left, I sat on my couch and stared at my phone, scrolling through my contacts trying to think of who I could call. My mom would panic. Natalie lived 40 minutes away. My sister was busy with wedding planning. I had never felt so completely, terrifyingly alone. That afternoon, I did something I should have done weeks earlier. I called my landlord, a man named Gene Whitfield, who I had only met once when signing the lease. He answered on the 3rd ring, his voice gravelly like he had just woken up from a nap. I asked him as calmly as I could manage if anyone else had a key to my unit. There was a pause. Too long, I thought, before he said no. Just him. I told him about the break-ins, about the police, about the footprint. Another pause. Then he said something that made everything click into a horrible, sickening place. "You know the other unit isn't empty anymore, right? I rented it out about 3 weeks ago." 3 weeks. The same amount of time the disturbances had been happening. I asked who the tenant was, and Gene said he couldn't give out that information, privacy policy and all that. But he did say it was a single man, quiet, paid in cash, kept to himself. My hands went cold. A shared wall. A duplex with a shared wall and, I realized with growing horror, probably shared access points I had never thought to check. The attic, the basement. Old houses like this sometimes had connecting passages that were never properly sealed. I thanked Gene and hung up, my mind racing faster than I could keep up with. I didn't wait for the police this time. I grabbed my keys, my phone, and a bag with enough clothes for a few days, and I drove straight to Natalie's apartment. I didn't go back to that duplex alone, not ever. Natalie's boyfriend and 2 of his friends went with me 2 days later to get the rest of my things, and while they were loading boxes into the truck, one of them checked the basement. He found it. A door. Not a real door, but a panel in the drywall that had been cut and fitted back into place, hidden behind the water heater. It opened into the other unit's basement. There were blankets on the floor on the other side, empty food wrappers, a flashlight. The police arrested the man living next door that same week. His name was Elliot Bryce, 43 years old, with a history of stalking charges in 2 different states. He had been watching me through that panel, coming into my home at night, standing in my kitchen, walking toward my bedroom while I slept. The police said I was lucky. Lucky. I still have nightmares about that footprint, facing the hallway, facing me. I still check my locks 4 times before bed, even though I live in a new apartment now with Natalie as my roommate. Some nights I wake up at 3 in the morning, heart pounding, listening for the soft thump of a door. I don't think that feeling will ever go away. Cedar Ridge, Ohio became my home after my divorce finalized in 2016, right around my 10th high school reunion. I packed everything I owned into a rented truck and drove 6 hours to a small town where nobody knew my name or my history. I found a modest 2-bedroom house on Willow Creek Drive, the kind of place with a big backyard and neighbors who waved from their porches. My sister thought I was running away from my problems, but I called it reclaiming my peace. The first few weeks were quiet, almost too quiet, and I spent most of my time unpacking boxes and learning which floorboards creaked at night. I worked remotely as a technical writer, which meant I could live anywhere with decent internet, and Cedar Ridge had just enough civilization to keep me connected without feeling suffocated. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe without someone watching me do it wrong. I met Allison Kramer on my 3rd Saturday in the neighborhood. She came over with a plate of homemade brownies and a smile so wide it seemed to stretch beyond her face. Her blonde hair was always pulled back in a neat ponytail, and she had these pale blue eyes that reminded me of shallow water in the summer. What struck me immediately was how she dressed. Long sleeves even though it was the middle of June, and the humidity made everything stick to your skin. I remember thinking maybe she had a skin condition, or was just one of those people who ran cold no matter the weather. She told me she lived 3 houses down with her husband, Raymond, and that they had been in Cedar Ridge for almost 4 years. Allison had this nervous energy about her, like a bird that never quite settled on a branch, but her warmth was genuine. She invited me over for coffee the following Monday, and just like that, I had my first friend in town. Over the next 2 months, Allison and I became close. We had coffee together at least 3 times a week, sometimes at her place, sometimes at mine. She loved to bake and was constantly trying new recipes: lemon bars, cinnamon rolls, apple pie with a lattice crust so perfect it looked like it belonged in a magazine. Her house was immaculate, almost obsessively clean, with white furniture and beige carpets that never showed a single stain. Raymond worked long hours at some logistics company 2 towns over, so most of the time it was just Allison and me sitting in her kitchen while the afternoon sun poured through the windows. She asked me a lot about my divorce, about my ex-husband, about what it felt like to finally be free. There was something hungry in the way she listened, like she was collecting information for a test she knew was coming. I told her everything and she nodded along, but whenever I asked about her own marriage, she would change the subject or suddenly remember something she needed to do in the other room. I started noticing things. Small things at first, the kind you brush off because you do not want to be the person who assumes the worst about everyone. One afternoon in July, Allison reached for the sugar bowl, and her sleeve rode up just enough for me to see a bruise on her forearm. Purple and yellow at the edges, the kind that takes weeks to fade. She caught me looking and pulled her sleeve down so fast it was like a reflex she had practiced 1,000 times. I did not say anything because I did not know how, and she smiled and kept talking about her grandmother's shortbread recipe like nothing had happened. Another time, I stopped by unannounced and heard Raymond's voice through the screen door. Low and sharp, the words unclear but the tone unmistakable. When Allison answered the door, her eyes were red and she told me it was allergies. It was the middle of summer and nothing was blooming. I wanted to ask, I wanted to push, but something in her expression told me she was not ready to let me in that far. On a Wednesday evening in late August, Allison texted me around 7. She said she wanted to talk, that there was something she had been meaning to tell me for a while, but never found the right moment. I told her to come over whenever she was ready, and she replied with a simple, "Tomorrow," followed by a heart emoji. That was the last message I ever received from her. I texted her the next morning asking what time worked for her, but there was no response. By noon, I had sent 3 more messages, each one a little more concerned than the last. Her phone showed the messages as delivered but not read, which was unusual because Allison was the kind of person who replied within minutes, sometimes seconds. I called twice and it went straight to voicemail both times. By the time the sun started setting, I had this tight feeling in my chest that I could not explain. Like my body knew something my mind was still refusing to accept. Friday morning, I walked down to her house. Her silver Toyota Camry was parked in the driveway, same spot as always, and the curtains in the front windows were drawn tight. I knocked on the door and waited, listening for footsteps or voices or any sign of life inside. After a minute, the door opened and Raymond stood there in a gray t-shirt and jeans, his hair uncombed and his face carrying the expression of someone who had been interrupted. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with hands that looked like they could crush a beer can without trying. I had only met him a handful of times before, always briefly, and each time he had this way of looking at me like he was measuring something, my height, my weight, how much trouble I might cause. I asked if Allison was home and he shook his head slowly, almost like he was savoring the moment. She left yesterday, he said, went to visit her sister in Michigan, family emergency. I asked why she had not told me, why she had not texted, and he shrugged and said she left in a hurry. Then he looked past me at the empty street and said she probably would not be back for a while. Something about the way he said it made me walk home faster than I needed to. I kept thinking about her car sitting in that driveway, about the text she sent saying she wanted to tell me something important, about the fact that she had never once mentioned a sister in Michigan in all the hours we spent talking. That night I barely slept. I kept replaying every conversation we had ever had, searching for clues I might have missed, trying to convince myself that I was overreacting. People leave suddenly all the time, I told myself. Emergencies happen. But then I remembered the bruises, the red eyes, the way she flinched when Raymond's truck pulled into the driveway while we were sitting on her porch. By morning, I had made a decision that felt both necessary and terrifying. I was going to the police. I drove to the Cedar Ridge station, a small brick building next to the post office, and walked inside with my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. A woman at the front desk asked how she could help me, and I told her I was worried about my neighbor, that something did not add up, that I thought she might be in danger. The officer who took my statement was a man named Douglas Holt, maybe late 40s, with a thick mustache and the kind of tired eyes that suggested he had heard every story imaginable in this small town. I told him everything: the bruises, the long sleeves, Raymond's explanation, the car still in the driveway, the text message about wanting to talk. He wrote it all down in a small notebook, nodding occasionally but not saying much. When I finished, he set his pen down and looked at me for a long moment before speaking. He asked if I knew anything about Raymond Kramer's history, and when I said no, he leaned back in his chair and told me something that made the room feel smaller. Raymond had been married twice before. His first wife, a woman named Christine, disappeared in 2009 after telling friends she was planning to leave him. The official story was that she ran off with another man, but her family never believed it, and her body was never found. His second wife, Megan, left in 2012 under similar circumstances, packed a bag in the middle of the night, according to Raymond, and was never seen again. Officer Holt said there had been investigations, suspicions, but never enough evidence to charge him with anything. He looked at me with an expression that was equal parts warning and apology, and told me to be careful. I drove home with the windows down, needing the air, needing something to anchor me to the real world because everything suddenly felt like it was tilting sideways. 3 wives. 3 women who vanished without a trace, all married to the same man, all living in houses with pristine white furniture and beige carpets that never showed a stain. I thought about Allison's nervous energy, the way she always seemed to be listening for something, the hunger in her eyes when I talked about freedom. She had been planning to leave him. That had to be what she wanted to tell me. Maybe she had found proof of what he had done, or maybe she had simply reached her breaking point. Either way, she never got the chance. When I pulled into my driveway, I noticed Raymond standing in his front yard 3 houses down, just standing there with his arms crossed, watching me. He did not wave, did not move, just watched. I went inside and locked every door, checked every window, and sat in my living room with the lights off until the sun went down. A week passed with no word from Allison. I called her phone every day and it always went to voicemail, her cheerful voice asking me to leave a message that I knew she would never hear. The police told me they were looking into it, that they had contacted her family in Michigan, and no one there had seen her or knew anything about a visit. Raymond's story was already falling apart, but without a body, without physical evidence, there was nothing they could do except watch and wait. I started sleeping with a baseball bat next to my bed, something I had not done since college when I lived in a bad neighborhood. Every creak in the house made me sit up straight. Every car that drove past made me hold my breath. I found myself watching Raymond's house from my bedroom window, tracking when his lights went on and off, noting when his truck left and when it returned. On the 6th night, I woke up at 3 a.m. to a sound I could not immediately identify. A rhythmic scraping noise, metal against dirt, coming from somewhere outside. I crept to my window and looked toward Raymond's backyard, and in the faint glow of the moon I saw him behind the shed digging. I grabbed my phone and called 911 with trembling fingers, whispering into the receiver like he might somehow hear me from 3 houses away. I told them what I was seeing, told them about Allison, about the history Officer Holt had shared with me, about everything. They said they would send someone immediately and told me to stay inside and away from the windows. I did not listen. I stayed right there, watching Raymond work that shovel into the earth, his silhouette moving in steady, practiced motions like he had done this before. The hole grew deeper and wider, and at one point he disappeared into the shed and came back dragging something heavy, something wrapped in what looked like a blue tarp. My entire body went cold as I watched him roll it into the hole, and I had to press my hand over my mouth to keep from making a sound. Within 20 minutes, he was filling the hole back in, packing the dirt down with the flat of the shovel, working quickly but carefully. By the time the police lights appeared at the end of the street, Raymond was already spreading grass seed over the freshly leveled ground, covering his work like nothing had ever happened. The police detained Raymond that night and obtained a warrant to search his property the following morning. I watched from my porch as they brought in dogs and equipment, as they cordoned off the backyard with yellow tape, as they started digging in the exact spot I had pointed out. They found Allison buried 4 feet down, still wrapped in that blue tarp, her body showing signs of blunt force trauma to the head. Her phone was recovered from a kitchen drawer inside the house, wiped clean, but still containing her final text messages, including the one she sent me about wanting to talk. The investigation expanded quickly after that. They brought in ground-penetrating radar and found 2 more sets of remains on the property, one behind the garage and one under a concrete slab Raymond had poured for a fire pit 3 years earlier. Christine and Megan had never left Cedar Ridge. They had been there the whole time, buried in the backyard of that perfect house with its white furniture and spotless carpets, hidden beneath grass that Raymond had carefully maintained for years. He was arrested and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, and I had to testify at his trial about everything I had witnessed, everything Allison had shared with me, everything I should have seen sooner, but did not. I moved away from Cedar Ridge 6 months after the trial ended. I could not walk past that house anymore, could not look at the backyard without seeing Raymond's silhouette in the moonlight, without imagining Allison's body being lowered into the ground. Sometimes I still think about that last text she sent me, the one where she said she wanted to talk, and I wonder what would have happened if I had gone to her that night, instead of waiting until the next day. Maybe I could have helped her leave. Maybe I could have driven her somewhere safe before Raymond realized what she was planning, or maybe he would have killed us both. That thought keeps me up some nights too. I keep in touch with Officer Holt, who retired last year but still sends me updates when there are developments in the case. Raymond is serving 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He never confessed, never showed remorse, never explained why he did what he did. Some nights I lie awake and remember Allison's smile, the brownies she brought me on my 3rd Saturday in town, the way her pale blue eyes looked when she asked me what it felt like to finally be free. I hope she found it wherever she is now. I hope all 3 of them did. Moving day fell on a Friday in late April, and I remember the azaleas were blooming all along Crescent Ridge Drive when the moving truck finally pulled up to my new place. My divorce had been finalized just 6 weeks earlier, right around my class reunion reminder that made me realize 15 years had passed since high school graduation. The house was a modest 3-bedroom ranch with pale blue siding and a detached garage, exactly the kind of fresh start I needed after splitting everything down the middle with my ex-husband. I had spent months searching for something within my budget as a veterinary technician, and this quiet suburb outside of Richmond, Virginia, seemed perfect. The neighborhood had that picture-perfect quality to it, with manicured lawns and American flags hanging from porches. I signed the lease without hesitation, already imagining myself drinking coffee on that little wooden deck out back. That Friday afternoon, as I directed the movers where to place my second-hand couch, I felt something I had not experienced in years: genuine hope. I had barely finished unpacking my kitchen boxes when I heard a knock at the side door. Standing on my small concrete porch was a woman who looked to be in her late 40s, holding a casserole dish covered in aluminum foil. She introduced herself as Jolene Whitmore, and she lived in the pale yellow house directly next door, the one with the white picket fence and the garden gnomes lined up like soldiers along the walkway. Her smile was wide and her handshake was firm, maybe a little too firm, and she immediately launched into what she called her welcome wagon routine. She told me about trash pickup schedules, the best grocery store in the area, which mechanic to trust, and which one to avoid. I appreciated the gesture, honestly. After months of feeling isolated during the divorce proceedings, having someone show genuine friendliness felt like a warm blanket. Jolene stayed for almost an hour that first evening, walking through my house and offering suggestions about where to put furniture, which rooms got the best morning light, and how the previous owners had struggled with the water pressure in the master bathroom. I thanked her for the casserole, and watched her walk back to her property through the gap in our shared fence, thinking how lucky I was to have such a welcoming neighbor. The first week passed in a blur of unpacking and settling in. Jolene stopped by almost every day, sometimes with baked goods, sometimes just to chat. She always seemed to catch me at convenient moments, like she had a sixth sense for when I was taking a break or stepping outside for fresh air. On Wednesday, she brought over lemon bars and mentioned how nice it was that I had chosen the back bedroom as my sleeping space instead of the master. I remembered pausing mid-bite, wondering how she knew that, since I had not mentioned it and my bedroom curtains had been closed since I moved in. I brushed it off, figuring maybe she had seen me carrying my bed frame through the hallway window or something. Small towns, small suburbs, people notice things. That was what I told myself. She also commented on how smart I was to shower in the evenings instead of the mornings, saying it helped with the hot water situation in these older houses. I had not told her my shower schedule either. But again, I rationalized it away. Maybe she could hear the pipes through the walls, or maybe the previous tenant had the same routine, and she just assumed. By the second week, the comments became harder to ignore. Jolene appeared at my door on Saturday morning, right as I was finishing my coffee, and casually mentioned that I should really stop leaving my kitchen window cracked open for so long during the day. She said it was an invitation for bugs and, with a little laugh, other unwanted visitors. The thing is, I had only started doing that 3 days earlier because the kitchen got stuffy while I cooked, and I only left it open for about 2 hours each afternoon. There was no way she could see my kitchen window from her house because of the angle and the tall wooden fence between our properties. I stood there in my doorway, coffee mug growing cold in my hands, and asked her how she knew about the window. Jolene just smiled and said she had lived here for 12 years and knew everything about these houses, every quirk and every draft. Her eyes held mine for a second too long, and then she changed the subject to the upcoming neighborhood barbecue. That night, I made sure every window was locked and every curtain was drawn, but I could not shake the crawling sensation that I was being observed even in my own home. I started paying closer attention to everything after that. I noticed that Jolene always seemed to know when I had company, even though my friend Heather only visited once and parked in the garage where no one could see her car. The next morning, Jolene asked me if my friend had enjoyed the tour of the house and whether she thought the guest room was cozy enough. Heather and I had spent maybe 10 minutes in the guest room, flipping through old photo albums and laughing about our college days. I had not posted anything on social media, had not mentioned the visit to anyone. When I told Heather about it over the phone that evening, she got quiet and asked me if I had checked my house for anything strange. I laughed nervously and asked her what she meant. She said her cousin had dealt with a stalker once, and the guy had planted tiny cameras in her apartment, devices so small they looked like screws or buttons. I told her she was being paranoid, that Jolene was just an overly friendly woman with too much time on her hands. But after I hung up, I found myself walking slowly through each room, scanning the walls, the corners, the electrical outlets, looking for something I could not even describe. That Sunday afternoon, I decided to do a deep clean of the house, partly to calm my nerves and partly because I needed to feel in control of my own space again. I started in the living room, moving furniture and vacuuming behind the couch, when I noticed something odd near the baseboard closest to the wall I shared with Jolene's property. There was a small hole, perfectly round, maybe the diameter of a pencil eraser, drilled right through the wood at ankle height. At first, I thought it was some kind of old cable outlet or pest damage, but when I got down on my knees and looked closer, I saw that the edges were clean and precise, not gnawed or weathered. I grabbed my phone flashlight and aimed it into the hole, but it was too deep to see anything. My heart started beating faster as I moved along the baseboard, and within a few feet I found another hole. Same size, same surgical precision. I followed the wall into the hallway and found 3 more, each one positioned low and angled slightly upward. By the time I reached my bedroom, my hands were trembling so badly I could barely hold the phone steady. In my bedroom, I found 2 more holes along the baseboard, both positioned with a direct line of sight to my bed. One was partially hidden behind my nightstand, and I never would have noticed it if I had not been specifically searching. I moved to the bathroom next, my stomach churning with a sickening dread that made me want to vomit. The air vent above the shower had always seemed slightly crooked to me, but I had assumed it was just old construction. Now I pulled a chair from the kitchen and stood on it to get a closer look. The vent cover came off easily, too easily, and behind it I found another hole drilled through the wall, this one larger than the others. But what made my breath catch in my throat was what I saw around the edges of the hole. 4 tiny screw marks in a perfect square pattern, and faint scratches in the drywall where something had recently been mounted and then removed. Someone had installed something there, something small enough to fit inside the vent and then taken it away. I thought about all those showers I had taken with the bathroom door open because I lived alone and valued the steam circulation. I thought about every private moment in that room, every inch of my body exposed, and I had to grip the chair to keep from collapsing. I called Heather first, barely able to form sentences, and she told me to get out of the house immediately and call the police. I grabbed my purse and my phone charger and drove to a parking lot 3 blocks away before dialing 911. The dispatcher asked me to describe the situation, and I realized how insane it sounded coming out of my mouth. My neighbor knows too much about me, and I found holes in my walls, but she took me seriously and sent 2 officers to meet me. We drove back to the house together, and I showed them everything I had found. One of the officers, a tall man with graying temples named Sergeant Briggs, got down on his knees and examined the holes with a small flashlight while his partner took photographs. He confirmed what I already feared. The holes were drilled from the other side, from inside the wall cavity that connected to Jolene's property. The screw marks in the bathroom vent were consistent with a mounting bracket for a small wireless camera. He said they had seen this before, that these devices were cheap and easy to buy online, and that whoever had installed them had probably removed them recently, maybe within the last few days. I thought about Jolene's comment about the kitchen window, and realized she might have known I was starting to get suspicious. The officers asked me to stay outside while they went next door to speak with Jolene. I sat in the back of the patrol car with the door open, watching the front of her pale yellow house with its cheerful garden gnomes and white picket fence. Everything about that house looked so normal, so wholesome, like something out of a home decorating magazine. Sergeant Briggs knocked on her door 3 times before she finally answered. And even from across the yard I could see the surprise on her face, the quick flash of something darker before she arranged her features into a pleasant smile. They spoke for about 10 minutes on her porch, and then his partner walked around to the side of her house while Jolene gestured and shook her head with exaggerated confusion. When the officers returned to me, Sergeant Briggs explained that Jolene had denied everything and refused to allow them inside without a warrant. She claimed the holes must have been made by the previous owners and that she had no idea what I was talking about. But he also told me something that made my skin prickle with fresh horror. His partner had noticed that the section of fence between our properties had a small gate I had never seen before, hidden behind an overgrown hydrangea bush on Jolene's side. The gate was unlocked and showed signs of frequent use, with worn grass forming a path directly to my back door. The next 48 hours were a nightmare of paperwork, interviews, and sleepless nights at a motel off the interstate. The police obtained a warrant to search Jolene's home based on the physical evidence and her proximity to the drill points. What they found inside her house was beyond anything I could have imagined during my worst paranoid moments. In her basement, she had a small desk set up with 2 monitors and a laptop, all connected to a wireless receiver. There were folders on her computer organized by date, going back nearly 3 years, containing thousands of video files and photographs from that house. The previous tenant before me had been a young woman named Allison, who lived there for almost 2 years before moving out suddenly. Before Allison, there had been another woman named Grace who stayed for 8 months. The folders had their names on them, and mine was there too, labeled with my first and last name and the date I signed my lease. The officers told me that Jolene had been watching and recording every woman who lived in that house for at least 3 years, capturing their most intimate and vulnerable moments through a network of tiny cameras she installed and removed whenever a new tenant arrived or left. Jolene Whitmore was arrested and charged with multiple counts of unlawful surveillance, voyeurism, and invasion of privacy. During the investigation, detectives discovered that she had been selling some of the footage on underground websites, making thousands of dollars from the recorded lives of women who thought they were safe in their own homes. The prosecutor told me that Jolene showed no remorse during her interviews, and that she spoke about her victims with a chilling detachment, as if we were characters in a show she produced rather than real human beings. I had to testify at her trial 7 months later, sitting in that courtroom and looking at the woman who had smiled at me, while handing over casseroles, knowing she had watched me undress, shower, sleep, and cry during my lowest moments after the divorce. She never looked at me once during my testimony, just stared straight ahead with that same pleasant expression she wore on her porch. The jury convicted her on all counts, and she was sentenced to 12 years in state prison. I later learned that the previous tenants, Allison and Grace, had both been tracked down and notified. Allison told investigators she had moved out because she always felt watched but could never prove it, and that people made her feel crazy when she tried to explain. I broke my lease that same month and moved to a different state entirely, somewhere flat and open, where I could see for miles in every direction. It took me almost a year before I could shower without checking the vents first, before I could sleep without pushing furniture against the walls to cover any possible holes. I still have nightmares sometimes, dreams where I wake up and find Jolene sitting at the foot of my bed, smiling that wide, neighborly smile and asking if I need any tips about the house. My therapist says the hypervigilance will fade with time, and maybe she is right. But I want everyone reading this to understand something important. Trust your instincts. If someone knows things about you they should not know, do not rationalize it away like I did. Do not tell yourself you are being paranoid, or that small-town people just notice things. Check your walls, check your vents, check the fence line between your property and theirs. Because the person bringing you welcome casseroles and offering friendly advice might be the same person watching you through a pinhole camera when you think you are finally, completely alone. Mail has never been something I paid much attention to, but that changed during a stretch of time when I was working from home and keeping a pretty steady routine. My neighborhood is quiet in a way that feels almost staged. Same cars parked in the same driveways, same older folks walking their dogs at the same early hours, same jogger with a neon orange vest passing by right before noon. I'd lived there long enough to know the rhythm of the place, so when envelopes started showing up with names I didn't recognize, I figured it was just the usual mix-up from the mail carrier. The first ones were easy to dismiss: a gardening magazine, a coupon booklet addressed to someone a few streets over. Nothing weird, but I kept setting them aside on my entryway table, meaning to drop them off later, and the pile grew faster than I expected. The tone of the mail shifted about a week in. Instead of catalogs, I started getting envelopes with windows showing official-looking headers: law firms, payroll companies, hospital networks from around town. One arrived with a bold red urgent stamp that practically shouted at me the moment I picked it up. The names changed every day. Different families, different addresses, all within a few blocks of my house. Sometimes the envelopes listed full addresses I recognized from my walks around the neighborhood. Yellow 2-story with the cracked porch step, brick house with the silver mailbox, and the wind chime that never stops rattling. Every letter had a weight to it, even before I read a single word inside, like each envelope was carrying someone's private life sealed in paper. Curiosity pushed me to check with a couple of neighbors to return what I assumed was their missing mail. I walked over to a place belonging to a young couple who had recently repainted their shutters bright blue, thinking at least the magazine addressed to them would be a harmless conversation starter. When I handed it to the guy who answered the door, tall, wearing paint-splattered sweats, he frowned and told me they hadn't been missing anything. He even showed me a stack of bills and letters sitting right on their hall table, perfectly intact. His reaction wasn't annoyed or confused, just baffled, like I'd brought him something from a parallel version of his life. That threw me off enough to try another house, this one belonging to a woman named Trish, who I'd chatted with a few times when she watered her plants in the late afternoons. When I showed her the envelope with her name, she blinked at it as if it were some kind of optical illusion. She told me she never saw that bill, never expected it, and hadn't noticed anything strange with her mailbox. She even joked that if someone wanted to pay her medical expenses, they were welcome to it. The joke didn't land, mostly because both of us were aware of how strange it felt, just standing there with an envelope neither of us could explain. I walked home with the uneasy sense that I was holding pieces of everyone's life, except my own. By the time the fifth envelope arrived, this one a pay stub addressed to a guy who lived near the corner with the leaning street sign, I felt something shift in how I looked at each piece of paper. It wasn't curiosity anymore. It was the awareness that every letter came from someone close, someone whose porch light I'd seen, whose dog I'd heard barking, whose trash cans I'd wheeled past on collection day. These weren't random strangers. These were people whose routines overlapped with mine every single day. And somehow, their mail was bypassing their own homes and landing neatly in my box, like I'd been selected for the privilege. The idea that it could all be mistakes felt thinner each time I unfolded another document with someone else's income, someone else's appointment reminders, someone else's court summons printed in stark black text. I decided to test a theory. Around mid-morning, when the neighborhood usually emptied out, cars gone, windows dark, driveways cleared, I sat in my living room, watching through the blinds. The mail carrier did his normal route, pacing with the same quick shuffle he always had, depositing envelopes without hesitation. He didn't slow down near my house, didn't look puzzled, didn't circle back. Everything about his routine felt identical to every other day I'd watched him pass. Yet when I opened my mailbox afterward, I found another letter addressed to a family 2 blocks east of me. Their house was one of the quiet ones during daylight hours. Both parents left early for work, and their teenage daughter usually wasn't home until after school. I knew that because I'd seen their driveway empty for years. Something about that coincidence stuck in my mind. I walked the route myself, from my house to theirs, taking mental notes like I was mapping the neighborhood in a new way. I noticed little details I'd never paid attention to. Which houses had curtains drawn all day? Which ones had delivery boxes sitting untouched on porches? Which driveways stayed empty from morning to dusk? The mailbox at the family's home was completely empty when I arrived, not even a stray flyer shoved inside. That meant the mail either hadn't been delivered at all, or had been intercepted before it reached the box. The stillness of the street felt unnaturally deep as I stood there, as if I had stepped into a snapshot of a neighborhood paused in time. When I finally turned to walk back, an older man further down the street waved me over. I didn't recognize him well, but I knew his house, the one with the metal rooster mounted above the garage. He asked if I lived nearby, and when I told him where, he let out a thoughtful hum and said he'd been missing a few bills recently. Not enough to panic over, but enough to make him wonder if the postal service had switched up something. When I mentioned the misplaced mail landing at my place, his expression tightened just a little. The way someone looks when something connects in their mind that they weren't prepared to say out loud. He didn't voice whatever thought rushed through him, but he did tell me one thing. His street stayed empty most weekdays, sometimes for hours at a time. That night, with the neighborhood settling into its usual patchwork of porch lights and quiet driveways, I laid out every envelope on my coffee table. Seeing them all together made something click that I'd been circling around without naming. Every letter belonged to a household that was consistently empty during work hours. None came from places where someone stayed home during the day. No retirees, no remote workers, no households with a stay-at-home parent. It looked less like a postal blunder and more like someone was tracking patterns, learning which houses stayed unoccupied for long stretches. The thought crept in slowly. Whoever was doing this didn't need the mail itself. They needed the information inside it, and they needed to know when no one would be around to stop them. I tried to shake it off as paranoia, but the next morning, while taking out the trash, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A thin strip of blue tape stuck to the underside of my own mailbox, positioned in a way that wasn't visible unless you bent down low. It wasn't old or weathered. The adhesive edges were clean, freshly pressed. A marker, maybe. A sign. Made me wonder how many other mailboxes in the neighborhood had the same subtle tag placed where only someone searching for it would notice. I walked down the block pretending to check for cracks in the sidewalk, and as I passed a few houses, I spotted identical strips beneath two other boxes, both belonging to families who were gone from early morning to late afternoon. I didn't wait to see what the next envelope would bring. I called the non-emergency police line and explained everything, from the redirected mail to the taped mailboxes. The officer who came out was a younger guy with a calm way of talking, the type who stayed patient even when he was trying to piece together a messy puzzle. He checked the boxes himself, took down notes, photographed the envelopes, and told me this wasn't the first complaint like it in our general area. He didn't say much beyond that, but his tone carried a kind of careful weight, like he didn't want to confirm anything until he had backup. He left me with instructions to keep any new mail that wasn't mine and to avoid removing any more tape if I found it. A couple of days later, the strange deliveries stopped completely. Not one misplaced envelope, not one unfamiliar name. The tape on my mailbox disappeared overnight without a trace, and the others down the street were gone too. I never got an update from the officer, and no one in the neighborhood brought it up again. Life slid back into its usual rhythm. But every time I walk past a house with an empty driveway, or see a package sitting untouched on a porch, I think about how close someone came to using all of us as their personal blueprint. Whoever planned it backed off, moved on, or changed tactics. I never found out which. All I know is that for a short stretch of time, my mailbox became a doorway into a map someone else was drawing, one quiet household at a time. Nothing unusual was happening in my life when my neighbor asked if I could stay at her place for a few days while she traveled. I'd been working remotely, juggling a quiet routine, and her house was only a few doors away from mine, so it sounded like a simple favor. Her place always felt a little too still, like the walls held on to silence longer than they should, but I didn't think much of it. The first night there, I remember noticing how the second-floor window faced directly toward the street, angled in a way that caught every passing car's headlights. I didn't bother going upstairs, figuring I'd sleep on the main floor and keep things simple. The following morning, around breakfast time, my phone buzzed with a message from a delivery driver. He asked if someone new had moved into the house recently. The question felt random enough that I assumed he'd mixed up addresses, so I replied, letting him know I was just house-sitting. His response came fast, too fast, asking if the woman he saw in the window the night before was gone now. That line jolted me. I told him no one else was supposed to be inside with me, and he apologized in this hesitant way, like he wasn't sure whether to push the subject or leave it alone. I tried shaking it off, telling myself he must have seen a reflection or a shadow. By mid-afternoon, another driver reached out with almost the same question. This one said he'd dropped off a small package late the previous night and saw someone standing behind the upstairs curtains, unmoving, like they were watching the street. He asked if I wanted him to report suspicious activity. That offer sent a slow, crawling tension through my chest. I thanked him, said I'd look into it, and then stood in the foyer staring up at the second floor I hadn't even stepped into yet. The house felt different now, still quiet but in a tighter way, like the silence had thickened. I eventually made myself go upstairs. The carpet had that faint, dusty smell older houses get when windows stay shut too long. I checked the room facing the street first. Everything was exactly how my neighbor had left it. Bed nicely made, no footprints in the thin layer of dust on the floor, and the curtains half drawn in a stiff, untouched way. Nothing looked like it had been disturbed. Still, something about the room felt recently used. Not physically, but observed. I closed the door gently, walked back downstairs, and tried to move on with my day, even though a strange unease kept tugging at me. The second night was worse. I kept catching myself glancing toward the staircase like I was expecting to see movement at the top landing, even though that made no sense. I stayed downstairs again, lights low, trying to focus on a show. But every time a car passed outside, the faint sweep of headlights would skim across the living room wall and remind me of what those drivers said. Around midnight, I walked to the front window and looked up at the upstairs room. The curtains were still closed the way I'd left them, undisturbed. But the longer I stared, the more I had that creeping sense that someone else might be staring back through that narrow gap where the fabric didn't fully meet. I barely slept. When the sun came up, I went outside to get some air, and something subtle caught my attention. The curtains upstairs weren't where I'd left them. They weren't dramatically pulled back or anything like that, but shifted by just an inch or two, just enough to make a difference. I stood on the walkway trying to convince myself that I simply hadn't paid attention the day before, but I knew the angle had changed. The window was positioned so precisely that even the smallest adjustment altered the view from the street. It felt like someone had been watching the world outside and stepped away before the light returned. That discovery pushed me to check the room again. I climbed the stairs slower this time, listening for any sign that another person might be moving around up there. The door was still shut the way I'd left it. When I opened it, everything appeared untouched. The dust on the dresser looked the same, the bedspread still crisp. The curtains, though, up close, they didn't seem different at all. No wrinkles, no marks, no sign someone had pulled them. I stood there for a long time, longer than I meant to, trying to pick out anything out of place. Nothing moved, but the air felt charged, like the room held a memory I wasn't allowed to see. Before leaving the room, I crouched near the floor to double-check for footprints, scuffs, anything that could confirm what the drivers kept claiming. Still nothing. When I straightened up, I caught a faint scent I hadn't noticed before. Something like old fabric that had been exposed to nighttime air, the kind of smell curtains get when someone parts them repeatedly. It wasn't strong, but it didn't match the sealed-up stillness the house had carried since I arrived. I backed out of the room, shut the door softly, and tried to talk myself into believing I was making connections that weren't really there. That evening, I decided to stay awake longer just to see if anything happened. I kept the lights dim and positioned myself on the couch where I had a partial view of the upstairs window through the front curtains. Hours passed without anything unusual, but I couldn't shake the restless feeling that the house wasn't as empty as it looked. Sometime after midnight, while everything outside was still, I heard a soft sound from upstairs, almost like fabric brushing against itself. It wasn't loud, but it carried enough weight to make the hairs along my neck lift. I stared at the staircase, waiting for another sign, but nothing followed. Eventually, curiosity won over discomfort, and I took a slow step toward the stairs. As I reached the top, the hallway felt colder than before, not freezing, just touched by something that didn't belong to the rest of the house. The door to the street-facing room was open, which stopped me in my tracks. I was positive I'd closed it earlier. From where I stood, I could see the curtains shifting slightly, as if someone had just stepped away from the window. I walked in carefully, keeping my breath steady. The room was empty, completely empty, but the curtains were swaying in a way that didn't match the still air. It reminded me of the way someone leaves behind a subtle disturbance right after moving from a spot. I closed the curtains firmly, pulled them into place, and latched the window just to be safe. Then I shut the door, making sure I pressed it until the frame clicked. I went back downstairs and paced for a long time, debating whether I should just leave and sleep at my own place. But I didn't want to abandon my neighbor's house or make her worry. So I stayed. When morning finally came, I walked outside and looked back up at the window with that lingering dread still tugging at me. And there it was again. The curtains parted just enough to form a narrow viewing line toward the street, as if someone had spent the night standing exactly where those drivers swore they saw a figure. That was the moment I stopped second-guessing myself. I locked the house up, texted my neighbor to let her know I needed to step out for a bit, and returned only during daylight for the rest of her trip. Nothing else happened after that. The curtains stayed exactly where I left them each night, untouched, but whatever had been standing in that window kept its distance once I refused to stay there after dark. Even now, I still can't explain who or what those drivers saw. All I know is that something in that house preferred the nighttime, and I wasn't about to share it with them again.